This is a Film Stories original podcast.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
We Made This.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you've just listened to, or maybe you're just about to listen to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Now, back to your scheduled programming.
Welcome to the X-Cast, the X-Files podcast created by Tony Black. I'm your special host today, Brandon Shea-Mutala. I've been on the show a couple of times talking about some X-Files episodes and some music and doing a little bit of the recap. But today, we have got ourselves a brand new guest joining us for the very first time to talk about an X-Files novel. Malcolm Crang, all the way from the other side of the planet. I think this is the biggest time difference I've ever had recording with somebody. You're in New Zealand. How's it going, Malcolm?
Great to be here, Brandon. It's going very well. I'm actually in Australia at the moment, but a stone's throw away from New Zealand.
I'm a criminal. I'm so sorry. I thought it was New Zealand that you were in. See, I'm tired. I've been suffering insomnia. This book has disturbed me so much. It's given me nightmares and I can't sleep. No, I'm just kidding. I am having insomnia, but it's not because of the book. But Australia is still very far away. Currently, it is 5:44 in the morning here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. Malcolm, what time is it where you are?
It's about 9:45 on a Saturday evening here. So pretty big time
Holy
difference.
smokes. So what's that, 16 hours, something like that. So we're circumnavigating the globe. Excellent, right on. Well, today we are actually going to be covering a novel, and this was the 4th original novel released, the 2nd hardcover, and the 2nd written by Kevin J. Anderson, and the name of the book is called Ruins. But before we get into the novel, being that this is your first time on the podcast, Malcolm, we have to ask you a couple of questions to find out if you're worthy. Your 5 questions of X. I'm sure you're worthy. I'm sure.
Fire away.
When did you first discover the X-Files, my friend?
I discovered the X-Files the first time it went to air here in Australia, which was probably for the rest of the world around the 2nd season. We got TV shows very, very late in the piece back in those days, and It aired on Network 10 here in Australia. It was very, very heavily publicised and very there was a lot of hype around the show when it first aired. So I distinctly recall watching the first episode, but I have to admit I didn't watch it religiously immediately from day one, but really sort of gradually found myself tuning in more and more and more until about the second season, when it just became no holds barred appointment viewing for me. I arranged the rest of my life around Wednesday night, 8:30, which is when the show aired here in Australia.
Wednesdays, that's an interesting night. Yeah, we had them in Fridays for the first 3 seasons and a little bit. I think it was in the start of season 4, then it switched to Sundays here in Canada. So
right, sounds very, very similar to the US, but yeah, it was always a bit of a Wednesday night fixture here in Australia.
What would you say is your favorite episode? And we will accept Ruins as an acceptable answer if this book is your favorite thing of the X-Files.
Look, no disrespect at all to Kevin J. Anderson, but I won't go with Ruins as my favorite episode. My favorite episode of the show, it's a very difficult question, as I think everyone says, but I would have to go with Pusher. That's the one that I would show to, and have done in the past, shown to people who have no knowledge of the show, who've are really just approaching the X-Files blind. I feel like obviously David and Gillian's performances, but Vince Gilligan, a pre-Breaking Bad Vince Gilligan, Rob Bowman in fine form. I just think Pusher is a classic episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a favorite around the network here. And I think that it's also Tony's favorite episode, if I remember correctly.
Well, great minds must think alike.
What would you say is your favorite season overall then?
In terms of my favorite season, I think the production staff and people involved with the show, a lot of them are on record as saying they think the third season is really where the show hit its straps, and I couldn't disagree with that. I do think in terms of quality, season 3 is really unsurpassed, but I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, and I'm going to nominate season 8 is probably my favorite season, just because all of the challenges around the production of the show at that time, season 8 really has no business being as good as it is. The show could have and should have been on its last legs, but I feel like it really got rejuvenated that year. And you only have to keep watching one more season to see how it could have turned out for the 8th season. But I think it's really fantastic year of the show.
Excellent, right on. Yeah, I think I agree. Season 8 is definitely underrated. Via Negativa is like tied for my favorite episode of the series myself. I love that one.
Yep, no, totally agree with you there, Brandon.
So who would your favorite character be on the whole series?
Look, I mean, the obvious answers would be one of either Mulder or Scully, but I will, for the sake of some novelty, I think I would elect probably X as my favorite character. I feel like any time that Stephen Williams was on the screen, you never knew what was going to happen. He really combined, hit that perfect note of menace, but also he was, I think, a pretty sympathetic character, and really just had an air of mystery about him that I think none of the other the informant or source characters were ever able to emulate to that degree. So I'm going to say X.
Oh man, it's like you're reading my mind here, because that was my favorite character too when I chose mine for my 5 questions of X. We got to do more X-Files podcast together. You know what? Is this love at first sight here? How do you feel about Shapes?
I think it's underrated, actually. I think Shapes cops a bad rap. I think there's some good stuff in there. I'm not going to say it's my favorite, but it's definitely up there as far as first season episodes that for me really, really captured the spirit of that first season of the show. I'm a bit of a Shapes fan.
Oh, right on. Me too. I think it's underrated. So yeah, take that, Tony. Take that, Zach Moore. Yeah. All right, so for our last question, what is your favorite moment in the X-Files?
Look, as everyone says, there's so many different moments of the show that you could nominate. I think for me, it changes day to day, but I would say that the end of Anasazi, the end of the second season, as I sort of narrated a bit of my own history of the show earlier, that second season is really where I think you started to see the potential of the show. And when that to be continued happened and you saw no one knew whether Mulder was alive or out of the boxcar, in Australia here they actually released the trilogy of Anasazi, The Blessing Way and Paperclip on VHS in a compilation called The Unanswered File. And I remember that was just the most popular video of the summer that year. It was rented out at all the video libraries. Everyone got around those episodes, and it was really, really, for me, that waiting and anticipation before you saw the resolution of those episodes is something that I think the show really blazed a trail with fascinating and always increasing the stakes cliffhangers. And I think Anasazi is probably the best example of that.
Oh man, these are like all my answers too. Like my first episode was for Aubrey, and so that's when I did my 5 questions of X. And yeah, I chose the end of Erlenmeyer Flask and Burn It from Anasazi. Yeah, because that was the ultimate moments. I saw them live, right? Well, I saw Anasazi live, so I had to wait all summer for that one. But yeah, that's definitely. So the only thing different is their favorite episodes. I had a tie between Drive and Via Negativa, and then I think season 1's my favorite season overall. But excellent, right on. Well, that's our 5 questions of X. So why don't we move into our main discussion on Ruins? So Ruins was, as I said, the second hardcover novel released. It was the 4th original novel released for the X-Files books. Written by Kevin J. Anderson, it was his second release of 3 that he wrote for the X-Files. And it came out in May of 1996, which was right near the end of the 3rd season. Now, I don't know what date the release date was, but I had a question. Since we've read this book, it doesn't really pertain and it doesn't really matter. But the episodes that aired in May of 96 were Quagmire, Wet Wired, and Talitha Kumi. So those were the 3 episodes. But I was wondering, Malcolm, when do you think this book took place? Because there was only the latest, there was one reference that I found in here that was the latest reference that I could place it. And I'm wondering if you caught that too.
It's a really, really interesting question. And I think it sort of gets to the heart of these licensed novels. When you're adapting a pre-existing property, it sort of has to be able to exist anywhere in the run of the show at that point. Obviously, not before the pilot and not after the 3rd season, but I would say, I think I picked up a reference to the chicken processing plant in Arkansas. So that was probably the latest reference that I saw. So I would say probably early 3rd season, if I had to guess. Skinner is around, the lone gunman are there. So yeah, probably somewhere early in that 3rd season.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. There was one reference. I was wondering if they were going to mention it with her being gone on the trip for so long. And in Chapter 9, the first line of Chapter 9 is with her little dog curled up asleep on the sofa. Scully flicked the computer. So she's got Queequeg.
Correct. Yes, I did pick that one up. And again, she only had the dog for probably half of that 3rd season. So somewhere around that time, you've got to guess.
Yeah, so Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose was the 4th episode of season 3, and Quagmire was the 3rd last. It was the 22nd episode. So, if this book came out before Quagmire, like if this came out on the 1st or 2nd of May, then it could have happened anytime. Who knows? So I just thought that was interesting to point out. But yeah, they did definitely mention Our Town a couple of times in the book. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, there were a few little nuggets in there. I think there was a reference to, obviously the book, spoiler alert, but the book takes place in Mexico, and there was a couple of references to Arctic research stations, which is obviously referencing ICE in the first season. So
yeah.
they dropped a few sort of express references to the show throughout the book, which is good little Easter eggs, if you can call it that, for fans.
Yeah, and they mentioned the Arecibo and Little Green Men. They mentioned a reference to that as well. So now, Goodreads gives this, normally they give during the podcast, they'll give a rating of what is it on, I think it's IMDb is their choice. But being that this is a book, we got a Goodreads rating, and Goodreads gave it a 3.5 out of 5 with 1,787 votes. Now, Malcolm, what do you think? Is that accurate? Is that low? Is that high? What would your rating out of 5 be?
Look, for me, it depends whether I'm rating it as a book or as an X-Files book. I would say as a just a standalone novel piece of literature, it's probably pretty fair. As far as the other licensed novels that adapted the show, I think Ruins is probably my favorite of the 5 or 6 that were written. I'd give it a slightly higher ranking if we were comparing it to other X-Files books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd probably agree with the 3.5 myself. I've been following along and reading the books, and I actually just finished reading Ground Zero before this, and I think I preferred Ground Zero to this book myself. Kevin G. Anderson's writing style was a breath of fresh air after Charles Grant's from Whirlwind and Goblins. And, Kevin G. Anderson really did a good job. And what I like about his writing is the detail that he gives these secondary characters. Like, he really spends time with the secondary characters, and you get a feel for who they are. And, Charles Grant didn't really do that in the other 2 books. So that's one thing that I really enjoyed about Kevin G. Anderson's writing in these books a lot. This was a good book. I enjoyed it. I think I just enjoyed Ground Zero a little bit more myself. So I'd probably agree with the 3.5 rating. Now, as far as tie-in fiction, I don't know what other types of fandom you have. I'm a huge tie-in fiction reader. And I mean, just off to the camera, we're doing a kind of a Skype-like chat right now. I've got, hundreds of Star Trek books over here and over here, so I'm all about the tie-in fiction. I've got Indiana Jones tie-in fiction. I've got X-Files tie-in fiction. I've always been a huge tie-in fiction reader, and I bought this book in hardcover when it originally came out. I haven't read it since then, but I'm curious, Malcolm, how are you with regards to tie-in fiction? Is it just something that you do once in a while, or are you a big tie-in fiction reader?
Look, you asked the question, Brandon. I'm actually struggling to think of another property where I've read, an original novel, tie-in novel for the show. The X-Files is really my preeminent fandom. I like plenty of other shows and movie franchises, but never really got into Star Trek or Star Wars or any of those. But I have to admit that Kevin J. Anderson, as an author, I distinctly recall, I'm a bit like you, I had a copy of this book back in the 90s and read it cover to cover, I think twice even, when I was a teenager. But Kevin J. Anderson really had some notoriety as a tie-in author.
Yeah.
I saw his name all over Star Wars novels, and I think he's since gone on to do a lot of Dune novels. I have to admit I can't say that I've read any of them, but it was very clear to me reading Ruins and his other X-Files books that he gets the show. I got the feeling he understands the series and certainly has an affinity for it. The characters of Mulder and Scully, I think, were sometimes that voice didn't quite seem to be there for me. But as far as the plot and the feeling of the X-Files, I think his novels really capture that quite well.
Mm-hmm. I read his books when I was reading Star Wars novels at the time as well, and I think he wrote something called the Jedi Academy trilogy, and I remember really loving that when that first came out. I used to read the Star Wars novels as well, but I fell off the bandwagon because they were releasing too many in hardcover. And, as a teenager, I like to get things, if they're hardcover, I like to get them in hardcover. If they're paperback, I get them paperback. And as a teenager, I just didn't have the disposable disposable income to buy that many hardcover novels. So, I kind of gave up on reading Star Wars books because of that. But I remember that his books were some of the better ones and some of the ones that I enjoyed more. So I haven't read the Dune ones. I did pick up a couple more Kevin J. Anderson novels, and I know I had one called Ill Wind, but I just never got around to reading them. And I picked them up because I liked his tie-in fiction so much, and I thought he was such a great writer.
It's an interesting, I mean, obviously can't say I've got any experience of it, but I imagine it must be a very interesting experience or interesting exercise to write one of these tie-in novels, because you're adapting a pre-existing property. You really can't change much. Yeah. I mean, at the end of this book, Mulder and Scully and the rest of the characters have to experience a lot. It needs to have a plot and be propulsive and keep the reader interested. But at the end of it, Mulder and Scully have to essentially be in exactly the same position they were at the start of the book, because the show was never going to incorporate aspects of Ruins or Ground Zero or any of these other novels, and I don't know that much about how they were adapting them at the time, but it does seem as if 1013 kept a pretty close hold on the license. I know I've read somewhere online about the comics, the Topps comics, I think were very, very heavily edited and overseen by the guys at 1013. So you can only imagine that Kevin J. Anderson would have been under the same scrutiny, and he would have had to come up with a storyline and a plot which allowed the reader to get engaged, but also, as I say, the characters really can't go anywhere from this. So I think he did a great job of keeping the reader interested, but really adhering to those conventions of these licensed novels.
I think I'm going to have a little trouble talking about this book. Normally they do reviews on this. They kind of go chronologically through the book, but I mean, it's a pretty standard X-Files case, and I don't think that's really going to lead to a interesting discussion to do it in that way with this novel. So I'm going to just kind of try and touch on a few of the things that happen in the book. So in a nutshell, the catalyst for this novel is there's this team of archaeologists who've gone to this set of ruins, these Mayan ruins in Mexico. And the name of the ruins, let's see if I can pronounce it properly, is Zitaclan? Is that how you said it?
Well, I not to embarrass you at all, but I think you did a very good job there, Brandon. I listened to the Audible copy of the book most recently, and that's pretty much perfect. I think Zitaclan or Zitaclan, something along those lines is how it's supposed to be pronounced, I gather.
Excellent, because I remember in the Star Wars novel, Shadows of the Empire, I think it was, whatever the one was that was supposed to take place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, there was a guy's name, and his name was Prince Shizor, and he had an X as a first name. So I'm like, I hope this is not Shitaclan. So, anyways, but so that's kind of funny. But anywho, so they go to these Zitaclan ruins, and this woman, Cassandra Rubicon, is the lead. And while she's down there searching these ruins, these militaristic type people come, and they kind of are attacking her group and whatnot. She ends up on the run, and this very large, bright light makes her kind of like disappear. And so Mulder and Scully are brought in on this because of the missing group of people being American citizens. And Cassandra Rubicon's father actually decides to launch this investigation and say, let's go find my daughter. So what do you think about the catalyst for the story? Is this a traditional type of X-Files catalyst, do you think?
Well, the one thing that I kept thinking about the most recently, and I have to admit it didn't cross my mind even the first time when I read the book, but the pretense for Mulder and Scully to travel down to Mexico, which is obviously completely outside FBI jurisdiction, I did think that was probably glossed over. But as far as that opening chapter and the setup, I thought it was really great. You learn a lot about the team. You learn a lot about Cassandra as much as you can in one chapter. And as far as giving you someone to identify with and empathize with, I thought the setup was pretty good. But that jurisdictional issue aside, and let's be honest, in the show they went to Norway, they crossed, as well as the 50 states, they kind of crossed the globe. So it really shouldn't matter too much. But the some of the other lapses in logic throughout the book really came to the fore this time for me, and I don't know whether that's just reading it with a bit more maturity or what, but there were a few plot points this time that had me furrowing my brow and saying, really, why would that character do that? But maybe we can get into those a bit later.
Sure, yeah. Make sure you bring those when we hit them. So Cassandra's father, Vladimir, is kind of the catalyst as well. He's kind of pulled some strings and whatnot in order to get them down there and searching for his daughter, and he decides to come along with them and he's paying his own way, which I found kind of interesting as well as I was reading. I don't remember reading this novel from the first time, so I know I have read it, but I didn't remember anything about it when I got back into it. So this is basically a fresh read for me. So, but yeah, so her father is a archaeologist as well. And so his daughter's kind of taken after him, and they've gone to these ruins. And while they're down there, like while they end up in Mexico, you know, they meet with these leaders, the police leaders and whatnot, and they're trying to get to the camp. They hire a few. Rubicon actually ends up using some of his contacts in order to get, you know, an expedition together to get them out to camp. Right, so it's probably a good thing that this character came along in order to help them. You know, being a novel, they could have written it any way they wanted, but they used him and used his contacts as a way for them to get to the ruins, the Zitaclan ruins.
Yeah, I thought Vladimir Rubicon was probably the most fleshed out secondary character in the novel, if you want to call him a secondary character. I thought he certainly seemed to be the one that maybe behind Aguilar that we spend the most time with. Mm-hmm. And I thought he was pretty well written. The relationship between he and Cassandra, you learn a little bit about that. But as you mentioned, the getting them out to the ruins, using those connections, that was one of these plot holes for me that really didn't stack up. I just didn't understand why, and this is again on second reading, knowing how it turns out, didn't understand why Aguilar agreed to take 2 FBI agents and the father of a woman that he has not, you know, he doesn't know where Cassandra is at that point. She's missing. It really left me wondering, why is this guy taking them out to the ruins where he's possibly just incriminating himself? And certainly going to have to have some questions to answer. Mm-hmm. And I think he did it all for $1,000 or thereabouts. It didn't seem like a lot of money. He's obviously written as a greedy character, but that was one thing to me that had me wondering: is this just in service of the plot? Because Mulder and Scully have to get to the ruins, otherwise we wouldn't have this book.
Right, because Aguilar is involved with this rebel group that's trying to fight for an independent state within Mexico. And I'm trying to find here as I'm looking here. I didn't take any notes. I apologize to the listeners. Do you remember the name of the group that he worked for?
I think it was, and again, the benefit of listening to the audiobook, something along the lines of Liberación Quintana Roo.
That's correct. Yeah, I just found that here. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a very early chapter involving the lone gunman, which, again, really just, it's good to see the lone gunman in novel form, but I think their whole purpose in the book is just to explain and give the reader some exposition that there is this breakaway group in the Yucatan who's trying to establish its own state. And as you say, Aguilar is involved with them in some capacity, but I got the sense that his character was written a bit more cynically. He didn't seem to be a true believer, so to speak. He seemed to kind of be involved, but not really passionate about the cause.
Yeah, he was. I think they had said in there that he was just in it for the money.
Yes, yeah, because he's exploiting or trying to commercialize the artifacts at the same time.
Right, because this group of people, they're stealing the artifacts in Mexico from these ruins and selling them to people in order to fund their revolution. And we find this one character, again, who's really well flushed out. And I'm sorry I'm so bad with names, but it's Xavier Salida. And he's this guy who was like, he came up from nowhere. He had no money, but he ended up with money. And so because he has money, he feels he has to spend it. So he's trying to live this rich lifestyle, but he doesn't really know what he's buying. So he's kind of an easy mark for these people to sell these artifacts to and get a high dollar for these things that they find. And again, this Xavier character is a really well-written character and really interesting. And one of these artifacts that he buys it causes this weird explosion on his property and blows him up, wipes out his property, which brings in the U.S. military because they think that these people have got this rogue weapons and they're all drug lords that are fighting, and so they want to send the American military in order to try and put a stop to this, what they think is nuclear warfare that's going on in this Mexican area. And so for me, that was one step too many in the book, and that's what kind of brought this down, was having this extra plot line of this American military being brought in. So I wanted, before we get more into that, I wanted to talk to you about the American military, and what did you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, as I said earlier, I think Anderson certainly understands the show, and having the military, having the government, the US government, nefarious characters within the government acting in ways that thwart Mulder and Scully is kind of a staple of the show. So I thought from that point of view, it worked. But I do agree with you. There was no suggestion that the military forces in the book were even aware that Mulder and Scully were there, that they were aware that it was, and again, spoilers, but they didn't seem to be aware at all of the history of Zitaclan and the alien kind of presence there. They just, as you say, seemed to be under the misapprehension that this was some kind of a military base with nuclear capabilities, which, as you say, it is a bit of a stretch. It didn't quite ring true, but of some of the other issues I had with the book, I kind of went with that one. I thought it was okay. It certainly gives Mulder and Scully an escape route, I guess, in the end. But it certainly was a bit convenient to set up that Mexican standoff shootout type scenario at the end. But
right.
As I say, I went with it, but I can see how you'd have that issue.
Because the reason that they went to these ruins in particular where Mulder and Scully are is because there's some type of a signal being sent, and they think it's a coded signal from, insurgents. This is their base, right? So that's why they've come to this particular location. Now, we'll talk in a bit about what that signal ends up being, but it just was a little bit much to me. Now, I don't know if you felt this or not. Like, I read the book, and I really was thinking a lot about Little Green Men while I was reading this book, and I got a really strong vibe of that episode because, they're going to this, these jungles of a Central American country, and, they've got to go deep into the jungle and deal with it, and then, these military people come in at the end, and, that's really a lot of what happened in Little Green Men, and we have this alien signal that's happened, and that happened in Little Green Men as well, and so I don't know, there's just a lot of Little Green Men in this book. What do you think about that comparison?
Right, I hadn't actually thought of that myself. I have to admit, and again, this is with the benefit of hindsight, having read the novel for a second time, I actually really identify this one with the movie. Actually,
yes,
which is interesting because the movie obviously postdates the novel, and the ending, which we will get to, but the ending for me really rings a lot of the same bells as Fight the Future.
Absolutely.
So that was the one I knew what it was building towards, and I was spotting that comparison quite heavily throughout the sort of third act of the book, if you want to call it that.
Right on. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about with the right now before we get into the main Mulder and Scully plotline with the military or these insurgents before we get into Mulder and Scully's adventure?
Yeah, look, I think one of the other things that I noticed again approaching the book was that I felt like it and as you say, Anderson is a good writer. The secondary characters were quite fleshed out. I did think it was a bit problematic that none of the Mexican characters in the book are particularly altruistic, if you want to put it that way. They're written quite stereotypically. I think every character is either corrupt or a drug lord or some sort of nefarious motivation. So that was something that really stuck out to me. I think the three characters that you've got are really the police chief, Barreo, Aguilar, who's very duplicitous, and then Xavier Salida, the one that you've already mentioned, Brandon. And I thought that we could have perhaps done with a character, an ally from south of the border, if you want to say that, who helps Mulder and Scully, because as it was, they just seemed to be foiled at every turn by the Mexican characters. I think the only other characters are the natives, who really have no character development at all. They're just there to sort of carry the bags, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree with you. The Mexican characters were a little bit one note for what they did. Like, again, Kevin J. Anderson did a good job of writing them and giving a little bit of back history for them. But yeah, they were kind of one note characters for what they did while they were south of the border. They were all criminals of some type. So that was kind of the unfortunate thing with the book. So I did want to bring up one complaint, and since we're going to start talking about Mulder and Scully's adventure right now, one of the problems that I had with the book in this one was, while I'm praising Kevin J. Anderson's writing style, there was one page of this book where, when they first discover I believe it's the hole in the ground, and they first notice the smell of sulfur and whatnot, there was like a page where Kevin J. Anderson just used way too many similes in one page. And it was like, it was over the top. Like he was trying to be this provocative writer. You know, like, I'm going to read a little bit here. Just a little bit of it. It's all on one page, all of these examples. He says, a group of spindly mahogany trees beside an old temple tipped, the roots pulling out of the wet powdery ground like a dirt-encrusted mat of tentacles. And then later on, the trees thrashed about like gnashing teeth. And like, there's a couple more on this page where it's just like there's like a whole bunch of these crazy literary similes in a short amount of time, and I'm just like, it actually really pulled me out of the book. I'm like, this is just too much. You're trying too much in this little area here. So I don't know. Did that at all stick out to you?
It's interesting that you say that, because I actually found I didn't notice that particular passage, but I found the descriptions, Anderson's sort of setup, to be really quite evocative. I thought he really captured the atmosphere and the feel of the jungle. But no, I didn't really have the same problems. One thing I will mention, though, that I found was really quite impressive about his writing. He seems to be a bit of a student of Central American history and the Mayan culture, because some of the explanation, and it's essentially just exposition, but some of his descriptions there were really quite fascinating. I think there's parts of the book which are almost like a non-fiction history of the Mayan culture. And on the book jacket, I don't know about yours, Brandon, but the book jacket that I have here, he's pictured in front of it looks like some kind of a Central American temple. So yeah. I got the sense that he was really quite interested in the topic and knew his stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one in the hard copy version. He's pictured in front of, it might be a Mayan temple, but I really got the sense that it was something that he had a personal interest in, and so a lot of that I found quite interesting. But I agree with you. Some of the descriptions maybe were a little bit overwrought.
Yeah. So this is page 127 in the hardcover copy, and there's actually, even on that page, there are two more that I'm going to read here. I wanted to find them all. At the edge of the jungle, the stressed ground split apart like a newly broken scab, bleeding foul gases. And then another one. From his vantage, Mulder could see the ziggurat rocking from side to side like a Chicago skyscraper in a windstorm. That is 4 massive similes in one page. And I'm like, dude, chill out. Like, I don't know. That was the only... I had a big problem with that page of the book. But, I mean, like, that's kind of getting picky. I just wanted to bring that out because it really, really brought out to me. It really stood out to me.
No, it's really interesting because, as I say, I listened to this as an audiobook this time. And so I didn't really quite have the context or the geography of seeing the similes that have come before and the ones that are to follow. But just on that point, actually, I will say that I think this was recorded in an audiobook by Mitch Pileggi at the time in 96 or 97. This time I actually listened to the Audible copy off Amazon, which is an unabridged copy. And I thought it was quite well performed and quite well read. I think the narrator was Patrick Lawler, who did a good job of conveying the characters, the different characters, and also the plot of the book. I thought the Audible copy was not to say anything bad about Mitch's version, which I haven't listened to in years, but obviously having the benefit of not having to abridge and cut stuff out of the novel, I thought that this audiobook was really, really well done.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Now, one of the major themes that they're talking about in here is some of the ancient Mayan beliefs, and they talk a lot about Kukulkan, which is one of the ancient gods. And, you know, you're not a Star Trek fan, but I know the first I ever heard of Kukulkan was in an animated Star Trek episode called How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. And, you know, it's an animated episode that takes place. It deals a lot with Mayan stuff. And yeah, they've got Kukulkan in there. But they talk a lot about Kukulkan in this. And he's one of the gods that they've made a lot of jade artifacts of at this site. So while they get to the site, you know, Mulder sees a few spooky things at night. You know, he sees some stuff in the jungle. But when they get there, they find this hole in the ground that's filled with water that was one of the Mayan sacrifices. And it stinks. They're smelling sulfur coming up from it. And that's going to be building up to something that happens later on. But they end up having to go in because they've looked around. They can't find any of this group of archaeologists that they're trying to find. So they find their equipment that's been left behind, and Scully puts on this diving suit, which I think is kind of interesting that they would even have that there, right? And they hadn't used it yet. Like, they would have had to have known ahead of time that this well of water was there, the archaeologists that had gone there originally. But anyways, they had this diving suit. Scully puts it on, she goes down, and it's one of the best scenes in the book when she's underwater, and you know she's going to come across a bunch of dead bodies, right? Because this is a sacrificial area for the ancient Mayans. But down there she finds four of the group, 4 of the people from the archaeologist troop.
Yeah, the I think it's called a cenote, the well, the sacrificial well in the book. I agree with you, Brandon. That was a really, really great scene. I thought it was really well written, and there was a real, as you say, you sort of knew what was coming, but a really palpable sense of dread when Scully was in the water. But I completely agree. The having the diving equipment there was, again, a bit convenient. I was surprised also that it's mentioned a few times. The events of the novel take place over only 2 weeks,
right? And
apart from the question of would they really be sending in the cavalry to find archaeologists who've been in the jungle and haven't reported back in 2 weeks, I'm not sure, but as you mentioned, having the diving equipment there, it really is clear on second reading. You can see Anderson really putting the blocks in order to kind of hit the plot points that he needs to hit when you know what's coming.
Yeah. So those are kind of plot points that stood out for me. It's interesting you mentioned that it takes place over 2 weeks because, like, as well as the final third of the book basically takes place over 7 hours as well. Like it's once the action starts happening, like, and that happened in Ground Zero as well. I noticed the similarity in his style of writing between the two books, that a large chunk of the back half of the book takes place in an extremely short amount of time. But I think one plot point that we missed while we were talking is that Vladimir Rubicon was killed. He was his neck was broken, and he was thrown in this pool as well, this pool of water, and they found him there. So they know that there's somebody in the midst that still believes in the sacrifices because they threw him in there. Plus, they found like a freshly severed finger from one of the people that they hired that was given as a sacrifice as well. So these people that they've hired to take them out there are still people who believe in these ancient Mayan curses as well. So. But after they bring up the bodies, Scully does a cursory autopsy and determines that they were killed with bullets. They were shot with bullets, but they were alive when they were thrown in the pool. So they were basically used as sacrifices to the Mayan gods, which I thought was an interesting point as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, I think it's one of the stronger parts of the book. Unfortunately, though, I do think that Scully's character in this book is probably a bit underserved throughout the rest of the plot. Other than that diving experience where she finds the bodies, she really doesn't have a whole lot to do. You mentioned that she does a cursory autopsy, but I did think that the treatment of Scully's character, or what she was given to do, perhaps could have been improved upon. She really has no involvement in the final act of the book at all.
Yeah.
And I felt that it was, again, a little bit, there was some plot points that were a little bit convenient, and it would have been a bit better to see her and Mulder involved, if not together, at least giving Scully some agency at the end there, so she has something to achieve or some goal, because I think she's thrown in a tent, and that's basically the end of Scully's storyline.
Right, yeah. So she's thrown in a tent because this American military force ends up there, and, they end up, Mulder's trying to convince him. He's like, look, this is just archaeological ruins. Nothing's going on here. And all of a sudden machine gun fire starts up, and there's this whole war zone going on because there are actually members of this liberation group here at this time as well. And so the military and this liberation group meet head on, and so Scully and Mulder had their weapons taken away by the military, so they don't have their weapons. Mulder runs. He kind of just takes off. I kind of missed why did he do that, but he just kind of took off. Scully told him to run, and this leader, this general or major or whatever his rank was, tells Scully to just sit in the tent. He orders her in the tent because he's protecting her, and Mulder ends up in this. What did you call it? I was pronouncing a C note. How did you pronounce it? This water.
I believe it's pronounced cenote.
Cenote.
But yeah, he climbs down there
because the water's gone. There's been earthquakes, right? So there's been a crack in the ground, and the water has disappeared. It's drained all out. So he goes down there. He climbs down a rope, and so he ends up in there, and he finds something while he's down there.
Yeah, correct. And this was the part of the book that really reminded me of the final act of Fight the Future film. It's really it hits all the same beats. Obviously, completely different setting, but we've got Mulder stumbling across a buried craft, finding a woman in suspended animation, the two of them climbing back out, and then the craft somehow rising up out of the ground and flying away, and of course conveniently Scully misses the whole thing,
right?
But I've kind of just skipped over most of our conversation there, Brandon, but it was something that I felt was really, really similar to the final act of the movie. And it's interesting that, as you said, this book came out in 1996, so 2 years before the film was released, but right around the time that the script for the movie would have been being written. And they're different enough that, you know, I don't think there's any suggestion that the movie was ripping off the book, but it really is quite an impressive scale and impressive spectacle in the book. Did you think that, Brandon, that the final act, the final scenes of the book, I thought that the scope on which this was taking place was really quite impressive and not something that the television show could have done.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, exactly what you're saying. I was thinking about Fight the Future as well while I was reading that part. Very, very similar. And yeah, this is definitely something that they couldn't have done on the show, or at least it wouldn't have looked so good if they had tried to do this in Vancouver. Like, to try and destroy these Mayan ruins, you know, like have an alien spaceship come by and destroy these ruins, you know, is not going to be an easy thing to do. And the other added problem that they have is these earthquakes have started to, you know, cause a volcano to occur, right? And so that's kind of why we had the gases earlier, I'm sorry, guys, I'm so tired. I'm trying to remember the name of the sulfur gases, sorry. The smell of sulfur from earlier is because the cracks are opening up and we're getting lava and gases from the center of the earth coming out. And so they've also got to run from lava as well at the end.
That was another one of these interesting, based on real life. I had to Google it, but Anderson mentions a volcano in Mexico in the 40s, which just popped up out of the middle of a cornfield, which is really setting up this possibility that the whole Zitaclan site is going to get eaten up by this volcano. But that was another one of these real life references, which I found quite interesting. It's always good to see the show or the storylines of the X-Files referencing and making use of real life events.
Yeah, that was a great thing about the show, is how they would always have their stories rooted in reality. You know, this is science fiction, however, it's based on something that has happened.
Exactly. And for me, that's always been one of the attractions of the show was, you know, no matter when you enter into it, it's always taking place now. Aside from a few exceptions, obviously there's a couple of period episodes, but it takes place in the same lived world and reality of the audience.
Mm-hmm. You bet. Now, during this firefight, you know, Scully misses seeing the UFO take off. Mulder's like, "Scully, did you see it?" And she's like, "Nope, I didn't see anything." You know, and they end up leaving because most of the U.S. military ends up dead, except for I think it's 3 of them. And so they just take one of the Jeeps and like take off, right? And while they leave, this Fernando, what the heck's the guy's name? Fernando
Aguilar.
Stops them and says, "I need you to get me out of here as well. I'm going to kill you guys." And then all of a sudden, Kukulkan comes and takes him away and eats him, I guess. We never see him again. So Scully actually does witness one of these weird these feathered serpent-like alien creatures.
Yeah, that was... I'm interested to know what your thoughts were on that, Brandon, because the feathered serpents for me were probably a bit of a bridge too far, to be perfectly honest. You mentioned that you couldn't quite buy the involvement of the military. It was these feathered serpent characters, which I call them characters. They're not, but their involvement seemed to me a bit superfluous. There's some explanation, and I think it's just Mulder speculating that they are pets or alien creatures who've been brought to Earth by Kukulkan. It didn't really ring true to me. I know we've seen, you know, many different types of aliens on the show, but the feathered serpents were one that I really didn't have any context for, and it almost felt, I don't know anything about Mayan culture myself, but it almost felt like Anderson was trying to involve some of the staples of Mayan archaeology there, just to try and work them into the plot of the book.
Yeah. While we're talking here, I'm going to bring up for you, so I'm sharing my screen with Malcolm while we're talking here. I'm going to show you the Kukulkan from Star Trek The Animated Series, right? So this is it here. So this is what I kept seeing every time they talked about it, right? Because this is the Kukulkan from that I first heard of, right, on Star Trek The Animated Series. So it's these blue wings with this purple feathers around its head, and it like talked to them and it just floated, and it was one of those old style animations. So just so you get an idea of what I was picturing every time I saw it. Anybody that knows the episode How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, yeah, that's totally what I was picturing every time.
It doesn't look particularly menacing in animated form, I have to say.
No, it does not. Excellent. So, I don't know. So, because I had heard of Kukulkan before, I actually didn't have a problem with Kukulkan and the reference to these creatures. To me, it was believable because it was something that I was previously aware of, even if it just was from an animated Star Trek series. I had always assumed that the animated Star Trek series just made it up. So to find out that, no, it was one of the beliefs, I'm like, oh, okay, well, then that's fine. I'm fine with that. I just picture this really colorful thing going through the forest.
Yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon. My reading of it was that Kukulkan, I think, was the being in the, according to the book at least, I think he's the being in the ship that is dead. And sorry for listeners, there is another figure in this ship that Mulder finds, where he finds Cassandra. And my understanding was that was Kukulkan, but the feathered serpents were somehow involved. I didn't quite understand. That was the bit that really didn't connect for me. But as you say, they're obviously established creatures in Mayan mythology. So it's a good way of trying to work that real life history in, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm nitpicking a bit, but it just struck me as something that I can't really picture the show ever doing. But then again, the show did some crazy things, and I could say that about a few episodes which did get produced.
Right. I don't know. There's not much else that I need to talk about the book. I mean, the case ends. They've got no evidence. Scully writes up a report where she's like, I can't confirm Mulder's story because I didn't see it. But, I did see this feathered snake-like thing, and it could be, because of all the Mayan artifacts that were creating this. Obviously, this was something that existed and is maybe one of these thousands of species that we just haven't cataloged yet deep in the jungles, right? And so she puts a scientific spin on it at the end, and I can see Scully there with her glasses typing up this report. And, that's basically the end of the book. So is there anything that we missed discussing that you would like to address here? Anything else that I might have forgotten to talk about?
No, look, as far as the plot goes, that pretty well covers it. I mean, the only other interesting thing I noticed revisiting the book is it was, and just looking at the context in which it was published, it was interesting to see that at the back of the book, it actually foreshadows the next book in the series, which I think was Antibodies, also written by Kevin J. Anderson. So
okay.
It's interesting to see how they were all being, I'm not going to say churned out, but they were all being thought of well in advance. Interesting that there was it would have been, Antibodies would have been the fifth book, was already being written before this book was published. So I guess that gets to the time at which this book came out in the run of the show. It's published in 1996. It's really the height of the X-Files' popularity. I think Ruins even made it onto the New York Times bestseller list. So it really would have been, and from my own memory was, a really, really popular book back in 1996 when it came out.
Yeah. Well, I got to ask, because I don't actually think that I've read Antibodies. I have it, and I have Skin, but I know that I haven't read Skin. I don't think I read Antibodies. But what is it in the book that references Antibodies?
It's not referencing in the actual narrative text. It's just at the back of the book. I think it says that Kevin J. Anderson's current projects include a third X-Files novel based on characters created by Chris Carter. So obviously it was in production, so to speak, at the time of publication, which I found really interesting. I back in the 90s, I was always surprised to and delighted to find these books on the shelves of my local bookstore, but didn't realize that they were so pre-planned and that the authors were thinking of them well in advance.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I see that it's on my dust jacket as well for my hardcover. Well, excellent. That's, if you have nothing else that you want to address for this book, should we go to the basement and see what the X-Files podcast listeners have to say about it?
I think let's go to the basement. I'm about all done.
So Sarah Blair says, "This is my favorite X-Files novel. I still think about the scene where they go down into the cenote."
Sounds good to me.
I haven't read it in years, but I can still feel the heat of the jungle and the tension of being out in the middle of nowhere. It was a great adventure. And we got a nice comment from Karen McKenna. She wrote, "I think the first X-Files poster I ever had as a teenager was actually based on this book cover. I remember I had the hardcover version of the book as well as the audio book on cassette tape read by Mitch Pileggi." What's a cassette tape? "I remember really thinking the way Mitch did the voices for all the characters in the book. He always had Mulder and Scully's tone down perfectly, which wasn't always the case with some of the other audiobooks, so that was really cool. I do remember it as being one of the better X-Files books of the time. I think it was supposed to take place somewhere around season 3. For the time frame, it seemed appropriate for the case to bring up memories of Samantha, and I thought that part was worked in pretty well. I do remember being frustrated with Scully's role, though. She started out really strong, but then gets sidelined halfway through, stuck with the military dudes while Mulder is out exploring a spaceship. And even by this point, it was getting old to have Scully conveniently miss out on seeing the alien stuff, though at least she did actually get to see the serpent thing at the end. I think my favorite part was when Scully and Mulder are kind of left betrayed/abandoned in the jungle, wondering if they'll be hunted down as the next sacrifice. They share a nice little moment together before all hell breaks loose, and you kind of feel the weight of the situation there. I kind of wish they'd kept that suspense going a little longer before the big shootout begins, because the tone never really gets back to that level of unsettled quiet desperation and just kind of remains chaotic until the end. I didn't find the enemies to be particularly interesting, though I do remember to this day the description of the dude with the ocelot hat. Overall, though, I thought it was a pretty decent adventure story, despite having a few nitpicks here and there." So it sounds like Karen is pretty much on the same page as us with her thoughts on the novel as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to hear that Karen had a poster of the book, but I certainly share a lot of her thoughts, and I don't want to labor the point, but that point that Karen made about Scully really not doing much at the end, it really doesn't gel with the way in which these events are described by Anderson as sort of earth-shattering events with bright lights and rocks and pieces of earth falling from great heights. You really have to suspend disbelief to think that Scully, who's behind some, a thin sheet of canvas, doesn't have any knowledge or any inkling that this is what's been occurring. But have to agree with Karen there.
Well, I guess that's all we've got for this book right now, so that wraps up our discussion on Ruins. Now, Malcolm, before we go, why don't you tell us a little bit about your book project that you have for the X-Files?
Sure. Well, my book on the X-Files is not a fiction book like Ruins. It's actually a non-fiction book. I'm a little bit old-fashioned in the sense that I guess I don't do a lot of contributing to message boards or that kind of fandom, but I've always had thoughts on the show and the themes and how the show is received within the world. So I wrote my own book a couple of years ago and put my thoughts down on paper. I tend to think that my own views on the show have maybe evolved since then, but the book's called Denying the Truth, Revisiting the X-Files After 9/11. It was written around the time, or probably just following the second movie, right around the time when it looked like we would never see the X-Files again, and that the X-Files was a distinctly 90s phenomenon, and really just interrogates that theory, I guess, that has been propagated by quite a few people, including, I think, Chris Carter, that it was 9/11 and the earth-shattering events that happened in 2001, which really spelled the end of the X-Files. So I decided to write a book about that and see whether or not that was indeed the case, just looking at how the show was received, but also the text itself and some of the show's politics, and, as I mentioned, how the show is set in a recognizably real world, and how that might have influenced the reception. But it's available on Amazon. It's not too expensive, I hope, but if anyone is interested, then I'd encourage them to have a look and see. Maybe if they vehemently disagree with me, I won't argue. But just a short little book about my thoughts on the show.
Excellent, right on. Well, it's one more X-Files novel than I have written, or X-Files book than I have written. So. Excellent, right on. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the X-Cast. Thank you for joining us for your first time. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you online? My
pleasure, Brandon. Well, look, I'm on The Basement, but I don't have Twitter. I don't have a lot of the other connections that people might be able to find me online. As I mentioned, there's the book on Amazon, but otherwise I lurk around the X-Cast fan page a bit, so I can be reached there. But really, really enjoy what Tony and everyone else is doing with the X-Cast and The Basement. It's as an X-Files fan, it's a really, really great way to get my fix every day, seeing everyone's thoughts and views on the show.
Well, my name is Brandon Shea-Mutala, and I have been your host today. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion on this book. And you can find me on Twitter at Brandon Shea-Mutala. And you can find me over on the Fandom Podcast Network with my friends Chris and Tom. And we have a show called Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast, where we go through all of the Alfred Hitchcock movies one at a time. And that's a whole heck of a lot of fun. So be sure to check those out. Give me a follow on Twitter. Every once in a while I've got something interesting to say. But I think that's all we've got. So be sure to check out the X-Files Basement, which we've mentioned a couple times already, where you get a lot of great discussion on X-Files topics. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at the X__ cast. And we give you updates there about all the podcasts that we are releasing. And, well, I think that's it. I'm going to go and have a sleep because I'm pretty tired. But until then... The Kukulkan is out there.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Frame to frame.
I mean, that was very nearly a James Stewart impression.
Oh, god damn it. There's supposed to be reindeer around here, but gosh darn it, I can't see them anywhere else. Oh, gosh darn reindeer around here. Anyway, sorry.
That I would have loved to see. Bad Santa starring James Stewart is what I would absolutely have adored to see.
I'm just trying to imagine.
Completely going against type.
So, say there, Sonny, what would you like for Christmas there? That would just be...
No, I don't care that we're recording the podcast. This is just for me now. Can you, as James Stewart, say the word fuckstick?
Fuckstick. See, I think this is where we actually tip over from semi-professional to non-professional.
No, I know, we should get back. I mean, we discussed the themes of the film.
Can I just say my impressions very rarely bring you joy? Maybe this is just the magic of Christmas is kind of like pickling your brain a little bit and is just making your faculties dim.
Either that or is that 9% porter that I'm drinking? One of the
exactly. Yeah.
Life's milestones.
Before we went to the fight, people testing out the shurikens on the doors and go, oh look, it's coming to the door, that'll do, that works. And I'll use that for the fight later on. crackers. Absolutely, it's true. It would never happen now. Wouldn't even get to that stage. But yeah, one side of the school would fight the other side of the school, girls included.
Good grief. I'm glad I didn't go to your school.
Free with this month's issue.
Last year's we had 6 CDs to choose from, one of which was a Christmas CD.
Yeah, we've got the remaining 5 because we fired one bullet on the Russian roulette.
Yep.
So last year we had Metal Hammer's Razor. So the remaining 5 in the chamber are X-Ray CD 11 from X-Ray magazine, Radio Crang Volume 1, Mojo's Blue Christmas, which is the bullet, at least for Ian anyway, Steve Lamac's Bootleg Session Volume 3 from Melody Maker, and Rock Sound Music with Attitude Volume 32.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.